Hi, welcome to the Silent Avenger channel. If you're enjoying the content, please consider giving it a like and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Let's dive into today's story. My name's Gerard, and up until a few months ago, I thought I had it all figured out. I'm an architect, a damn good one, if I may say so, with some solid projects under my belt. I built a life with my wife, April, and our daughter, Sophie. I thought I was living the dream, until I woke up in a hospital bed, barely clinging to life. It was surreal. One moment I was sipping a glass of wine after dinner, and the next, I was out cold. When I woke up, everything was a blur. I had been in a coma for weeks, the doctors said. Poisoning. The word felt foreign, like it belonged in some murder mystery, not my reality. They couldn't figure out what exactly I'd been poisoned with, only that it was untraceable and deliberate. But the kicker? The poison wasn't some random accident. My wife, April, a toxicologist, had been playing a much darker game than I could have ever imagined. It wasn't me who uncovered her plan, our daughter Sophie did. Sophie's always been sharp, maybe too sharp for her own good. While I was lying unconscious, she found some of April's research notes. At first, she thought they were work-related. But when she dug deeper, she realized they were detailed experiments on poisons, ones designed to mimic natural illnesses. And then she saw my name. I'm not proud to admit it, but I didn't see it coming. April was charming, intelligent, and manipulative in ways I now realize I was blind to. She played the perfect wife so well that I never questioned her intentions. Sophie, on the other hand, had been suspicious for a while. Something about the way her mom treated me didn't sit right with her. When Sophie confronted April, she denied everything, of course. But the damage was done. Sophie didn't trust her anymore. After an explosive argument, Sophie told her she was leaving to stay at a boarding school upstate, an excuse really, to put distance between them and gather evidence in peace. Now I'm out of the hospital, trying to piece my life back together while dealing with the gut punch of betrayal. My brother, Dwayne, stepped in to help, and he's been my rock through this. We've pulled together a small team, including a couple of private investigators and, believe it or not, some folks at the FBI. Apparently, April and her research partner, Justin Klein, have been running this con for years, targeting wealthy people and profiting off their deaths. We're walking on eggshells, pretending everything's normal while documenting every move April makes. Every smile she gives me feels like a knife to the chest, knowing what she's capable of. But if she thinks I'm still the gullible husband, she's in for a rude awakening. This is just the beginning, and honestly, I don't know where this road ends. But one thing's for sure, I'm not going to let her get away with it. After getting out of the hospital, my world felt upside down. Every step I took in our house felt like walking through a crime scene. It was the same home I'd built for my family, but now it felt like a stage where I'd unknowingly played the fool. April's smiles, her comforting words while I recovered, they were all fake. The worst part? I had to act like I didn't know. Dwayne moved into the guest room under the guise of helping me get back on my feet. April didn't seem to mind, but I could tell she was keeping her distance. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe she was just biding her time. Either way, it gave me and Dwayne a chance to start digging. Sophie, bless her heart, was relentless from her boarding school. She started sending me encrypted emails with snippets of April's notes and strange transactions she'd uncovered. Bank transfers, shady properties under Justin Klein's name, and what looked like payouts to unknown individuals. April wasn't just poisoning me, she and Justin had a whole network of accomplices, all profiting from these so-called medical research deaths. We enlisted the help of a private investigator named Callahan, a retired detective with a knack for sniffing out fraud. He quickly connected the dots. April and Justin weren't just targeting people like me. They were going after wealthy clients under the guise of medical consultations, convincing them to try experimental treatments for minor conditions. The treatments, of course, were laced with untraceable poisons. One name stood out in Callahan's report: Henry Davison, a tech mogul whose sudden heart failure last year raised a few eyebrows. He had been one of April's patients. Callahan found emails between Justin and April discussing how to make his death look like a natural progression of a heart condition. The payout? Over $5 million in inheritance redirected to a shell company tied to Justin. While Callahan was digging through their financials, Dwayne was busy planting bugs in the house. We needed to record everything. Every phone call, every whispered conversation, every suspicious move. It was risky, but we were desperate. April may have been smart, but she wasn't invincible. One night, I staged a vulnerable moment. I sat in the living room with a bottle of wine, staring at a family photo. April walked in, feigning concern. "Gerard, are you okay?" she asked, sitting beside me. I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing myself to look broken. I can't believe I was so close to death. If it wasn't for you taking care of me, I don't know what would have happened. Her eyes softened, and for a moment, I almost believed her. "You're here now," she said, touching my hand. "That's all that matters." I wanted to scream, to tell her I knew everything. But instead, I squeezed her hand and nodded. "I don't know what I'd do without you," I said, the words tasting like ash. After she went to bed, I listened to the recording. Her voice sounded genuine, but there was a slight hesitation when I mentioned how close I was to dying. Almost like she was holding back. It was subtle, but it told me everything I needed to know. April still thought she was in control. What she didn't realize was that every lie she told was another nail in her coffin. Slowly but surely, we were building a case against her. It wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about protecting Sophie, myself, and anyone else she might target. I wasn't the same man April tried to poison. That man trusted her. That man let his guard down. But now, I was done being her pawn. The more we uncovered, the darker it got. Callahan's files painted April and Justin as seasoned predators, but their operation wasn't just about money, it was about power. Their victims weren't random. They were chosen carefully, their deaths orchestrated like pieces in a sick game. Sophie's latest findings hit me hard. She discovered encrypted emails between April and Justin discussing not just their victims, but strategies for avoiding detection. They referred to it as the symphony. My stomach churned reading phrases like tuning the dosage and orchestrating the narrative. They were so clinical about it, as if they were discussing lab rats instead of human lives. What scared me most was how methodical April was. She kept records of everything, notebooks full of chemical formulas, autopsy notes, even psychological profiles of their victims. Callahan said it was her arrogance that would ultimately undo her. "People like her always think they're untouchable," he told me. "That's when they make mistakes." Dwayne took the lead on surveillance. He wasn't just my brother, he was my shield. While I focused on staying calm and playing the clueless husband, Dwayne shadowed April whenever she left the house. Her movements were mostly mundane: trips to the grocery store, the gym, the occasional visit to a cafe. But there was one regular stop that piqued our interest: a small, nondescript office building downtown. Using a hidden camera, Dwayne captured her meeting with Justin there. They seemed relaxed, laughing over coffee, but the tension between them was visible. Dwayne could only catch snippets of their conversation, but what he did hear sent chills down my spine. "He's weaker than we thought." "If we'd waited, it might have worked," Justin said, his voice muffled. April replied, "Timing's everything. We can't afford another mistake." The way they spoke about me, as if I were some failed experiment, ignited a rage I had to keep buried. The more they thought I was weak, the more they'd slip up. Meanwhile, Sophie wasn't just gathering evidence, she was rallying support. She'd been confiding in her boarding school counselor, a former FBI agent named Lauren Mallory. Mallory got in touch with an active agent, and soon, the FBI was officially on board. It felt surreal, watching this operation take shape around me. Agent Mallory advised us to stay cautious. "If April catches wind of what you're doing, she won't hesitate to escalate. You have to play along until we have enough to bring them down." But playing along was wearing on me. Every dinner with April felt like a test. Her laughter grated on my nerves. Her touch made my skin crawl. And yet, I had to keep the facade intact. I had to keep her believing I was still her loyal, unsuspecting husband. Then one night, something unexpected happened. April and I were having dinner, just the two of us. She poured me a glass of wine and smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Gerard," she said, her tone soft but probing, "you've seemed different since the hospital. Is everything okay?" My heart raced. Was she on to me? I forced a chuckle. "I guess almost dying will do that to you," I said, swirling the wine in my glass. "Makes you think about life differently." She studied me for a moment, her eyes sharp. "I'm glad you're still here," she said finally. "I don't know what I'd do without you." The irony of her words nearly made me choke. "Same here," I replied, raising my glass. That night, As I reviewed the audio recording of our conversation, I caught something I hadn't noticed before, the faint sound of her phone vibrating. She'd sent a message under the table while we were talking. The timing was too perfect. It had to be about me. Whatever she was planning next, I had to be ready. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was fighting back. And April? She had no idea the game was about to change. The next morning, Dwayne and I analyzed the recording from dinner. The timing of the vibration was suspicious, but the phone's message was encrypted. We handed it off to Agent Mallory, who promised to dig into it. For now, we had to assume the worst. April and Justin might suspect something. Sophie sent another batch of files that same day. Among them were detailed notes about Justin. He wasn't just April's accomplice, he was her equal in this operation, maybe even the mastermind behind their network. Sophie found a list of contacts tied to offshore accounts, several of whom were high-profile professionals, doctors, lawyers, even politicians. The deeper we dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about murder and money. It was about influence. April and Justin's network was sprawling, their reach terrifying. This wasn't just about stopping April anymore, it was about dismantling an entire operation. That afternoon, Dwayne and I decided to follow April to her next meeting with Justin. Using a GPS tracker we'd slipped into her car weeks ago, we parked a block away from her downtown destination. She entered the same nondescript office building as before, but this time, she wasn't alone. Two men in tailored suits followed her in. Their stiff postures screamed security, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Dwayne and I stayed put, waiting for her to leave. We didn't want to risk blowing our cover, but as the hours dragged on, my mind raced. What if this was something bigger? What if she was meeting someone even higher up the chain? When April finally emerged, her expression was tight, her usual confidence replaced by something resembling concern. She paused near her car, pulling out her phone. Dwayne snapped photos while I recorded her every move. She glanced around, her paranoia evident, before finally getting into her car and driving off. We stayed behind, watching the building. About 20 minutes later, Justin walked out with the two men in suits. He looked agitated, gesturing wildly as he talked to them. Whatever they discussed inside had rattled both of them. This was a rare crack in their armor, and I wasn't about to let it go to waste. The next day, Sophie sent another encrypted email. This time, she included screenshots of text messages between April and Justin. They'd been arguing, something about a leak in their network. My stomach flipped when I read April's message. "I'm handling Gerard. He suspects nothing." Justin's reply was cold, "He'd better not. One mistake, and it all falls apart. If he becomes a problem, we'll deal with him." I sat there, staring at the screen, my hands trembling. This wasn't just about protecting myself anymore. They were already planning their next move, and I had no doubt that dealing with me meant something permanent. That evening, I acted more vulnerable than ever. April cooked dinner, and I made a point of stumbling around the kitchen, pretending to be weaker than I actually was. She watched me closely, her expression unreadable. "Maybe you should rest," she said, her voice filled with forced concern. "You're still recovering." I nodded, feigning exhaustion. "You're probably right. I don't want to overdo it." As I lay in bed that night, pretending to sleep, I heard her on the phone. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but the words were enough to send a shiver through me. "We need to accelerate the plan. He's too fragile to last much longer." She hung up, and the house fell silent. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, every fiber of my being screaming that I was running out of time. If April thought I was fragile, she was about to find out how wrong she was. The next move was mine, and I wasn't holding back anymore. The next morning, I called Dwayne and Agent Mallory for an emergency meeting. April's late-night phone call had pushed the timeline forward. There was no more room for error. If she was accelerating her plan, we had to act quickly and decisively. Mallory brought the decrypted text April had sent during dinner. It was worse than I imagined. She had messaged Justin, confirming a delivery of materials. It didn't take much to figure out what that meant. Another poison, something likely tailored just for me. "This is it," Mallory said, her tone grim. "We're dealing with a ticking clock. We need to corner her before she makes her next move." We agreed on a new strategy: tighten surveillance, gather evidence on the broader network, and when the time was right, confront April with everything we had. But there was one major risk. To pull this off, I had to keep playing the clueless husband, a role that was becoming harder by the day. That evening, I set the trap. I invited April to dinner at my favorite restaurant. It was one of the few places where I felt safe, thanks to the surveillance cameras and staff who knew me well. She accepted, her smile as bright as ever, but I could see a flicker of suspicion in her eyes. Over wine and a carefully chosen entree, I leaned into the act. "I've been thinking," I said, swirling my glass. "Maybe we should go on a trip. Somewhere warm. Just the two of us." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she seemed genuinely taken aback. "That sounds wonderful, Gerard. Are you sure you're feeling up to it?" "I think a change of scenery is exactly what I need," I replied, forcing a smile. "Besides, I miss us. Don't you?" Her expression softened, and she reached across the table to touch my hand. "I do," she said, her voice almost convincing. "I think a trip would be good for us." But as the night went on, I saw through her mask. She wasn't agreeing out of love or concern, she was calculating. The trip was an opportunity for her, and she'd already started planning how to use it. The next day, Dwayne and I reviewed the footage from the restaurant. Nothing incriminating, but her body language spoke volumes. She was cautious, testing the waters. She wasn't ready to act just yet, but she was close. That's when Sophie dropped the bombshell. During her latest deep dive into April's files, she found a list of potential test subjects for future experiments. My name was at the top, but there were others, some of whom I recognized as acquaintances from the architectural community. It was like seeing my own death warrant, and I couldn't look away. I forwarded the list to Mallory immediately. She confirmed that 2 of the names were already deceased under suspicious circumstances, but their deaths had been ruled natural. April and Justin's handiwork was evident, even if it hadn't been proven in court yet. "We need to bring her in," Dwayne said, pacing the room. "This has gone too far." "Not yet," Mallory interjected. "If we move now, we risk missing the bigger picture. Justin and the rest of their network will scatter. We need a clean sweep." Every fiber of my being wanted to end it right then and there, but Mallory was right. If we struck too soon, April might walk free, and Justin would vanish into the shadows. We had to wait for the right moment, even if it meant risking everything. That evening, April suggested we have a quiet night in. "You've been pushing yourself too hard," she said, her tone dripping with false concern. "Let's just relax." I agreed, playing the role she expected. But as we sat on the couch, watching some forgettable movie, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was testing me. At one point, she excused herself to the kitchen, and I followed a few minutes later, pretending to refill my drink. What I saw made my blood run cold. April was at the counter, mixing something into a glass of water. She froze when she saw me, her smile forced. "I thought you might want some tea," she said, holding up a mug. I glanced at the glass, then back at her. "Thanks," I said, taking the mug and heading back to the couch. My hands trembled as I set it down, untouched. It was clear now, she wasn't just planning my demise. She was rehearsing it. That night, as April slept soundly beside me, I made a silent vow: the next move would be mine, and it would end this nightmare once and for all. The following morning, I woke with a renewed sense of purpose. April's little experiment in the kitchen had pushed me over the edge. She wasn't waiting for the right time to strike. She was actively planning it. If we didn't act soon, she'd make her move, and I might not wake up the next time. Over coffee, I played my part, acting none the wiser. "I've been thinking about that trip," I said casually. "Maybe somewhere by the water. A quiet island. Just us." April's eyes lit up, but there was something calculating in her expression. "That sounds perfect," she said. "When were you thinking?" "As soon as possible," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Maybe next week? I can clear my schedule." She nodded, her mind clearly racing. "I'll start planning," she said, smiling sweetly. "You just focus on getting better." As she busied herself with her phone, no doubt texting Justin about the opportunity, I excused myself and headed to the guest room where Dwayne was waiting. "She's hooked," I said, closing the door behind me. Dwayne smirked. "She's not as clever as she thinks." "What's the plan?" "We let her plan the trip," I said. "The more she thinks she's in control, the better. But we'll need backup, close and ready." Dwayne nodded, already texting Mallory. "I'll make sure the team is ready." Over the next few days, I watched as April transformed into the perfect wife. She cooked my favorite meals, doted on me endlessly, and even suggested we go for evening walks together. It would have been touching if I didn't know what she was planning. Every moment she spent pretending to care was another reminder of how far she'd fallen, and how much I had to lose. Sophie, meanwhile, was relentless. She sent another set of files, this time detailing a recent financial transfer from one of April's offshore accounts to an unidentified recipient. Mallory's team traced it to a private investigator April had hired. It seemed she wasn't just planning my demise, she was also keeping tabs on me. Classic projection, Mallory said during our next meeting. She's paranoid because she assumes you're just as devious as she is. Good, I said. Let her think I'm harmless. It'll make her mistakes even bigger. The trip was booked for the following week, a remote beachside villa on an island April had always wanted to visit. She was giddy, describing the private chef, the infinity pool, and the secluded location. It's exactly what we need, she said one night as we packed. A fresh start. I forced a smile, nodding along. It sounds perfect. But behind the scenes, Mallory and her team were working overtime. They coordinated with local authorities and the villa's staff, ensuring every corner of the property was under surveillance. If April tried anything, we'd have it on record. The day before we were set to leave, April received a call from Justin. She stepped onto the patio to take it, but Dwayne's bugs picked up every word. "What about Gerard?" Justin asked, his voice sharp. "I told you I have it under control," April replied, her tone icy. "By the time we get back, it'll all be done." Justin hesitated. "You'd better be right. We can't afford another slip-up." April ended the call, her face unreadable. She walked back inside and smiled at me as if nothing had happened. "Just Justin being paranoid," she said casually. "He always worries too much." I nodded, playing along. Inside, though, I was seething. This trip wasn't just a trap for me, it was her last attempt to silence me permanently. But she'd underestimated me, and she had no idea the trap was already set. As we boarded the plane the next morning, I forced myself to relax, to let April believe she had the upper hand. But as the island came into view, I made a silent promise to myself. This would end here on my terms. April had orchestrated my near-death once, but this time, I was writing the final note in her twisted symphony. The island was as picturesque as April had described. Pristine white sand, turquoise water, and the kind of solitude that could make you forget the rest of the world existed. To anyone else, it might have looked like the perfect getaway. To me, it felt like walking into a lion's den. April was radiant as we stepped off the private boat. She chatted with the villa staff, charming them effortlessly as they showed us around. The villa itself was a dream, floor-to-ceiling windows, a sprawling terrace, and a private pool overlooking the ocean. But the beauty only heightened my sense of dread. This wasn't a vacation. It was her stage. I stayed close to her side, playing the doting husband while stealing glances at the staff. Every one of them was in on the plan, thanks to Mallory. Cameras were hidden in the common areas, microphones in the bedroom and kitchen. Even the private chef had been briefed, ensuring nothing could happen without being documented. That first night, April poured us both a glass of champagne as we watched the sunset. "To us," she said, raising her glass. Her smile was warm, but her eyes were calculating. "To us," I echoed, clinking my glass against hers. I took a careful sip, letting her see me drink, even though I knew Mallory's team had already tested the bottle. The evening passed uneventfully, but I could feel the tension building. April was waiting for the right moment, and I had to be ready when she struck. The next day, we explored the island. April insisted on a hike to a secluded cove, and while the scenery was breathtaking, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was scouting the perfect place to make her move. Every step I took felt heavy, like I was walking towards something inevitable. We stopped for a picnic by the water. April was all smiles, snapping pictures of us together and offering me bites of the food she'd packed. I played along, even as my stomach churned. I had no doubt she'd laced something with whatever new poison she and Justin had cooked up. But thanks to Mallory, every bit of food and drink had been tested before I touched it. That night, things took a darker turn. Over dinner, April brought up a topic she hadn't mentioned in months: my health. "You've been so strong," she said, her voice soft. "But I worry about you, Gerard. I can see how much the hospital took out of you." I nodded, keeping my tone neutral. "It was rough, but I'm feeling better every day." She reached across the table, taking my hand. I want to help. I've been reading about some new supplements that could really boost your recovery. Maybe we could try them when we get back. I forced a smile. That sounds great. Whatever you think is best. Her smile widened, but there was something predatory about it. She thought she had me. She thought I was still the naive husband who trusted her implicitly. After dinner, April suggested a night swim. The moonlight on the pool made the water shimmer like liquid silver. I followed her in, feigning relaxation even as my senses stayed on high alert. She swam close, wrapping her arms around me. "You're everything to me, Gerard," she murmured, her lips brushing against my ear. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, but I kept my expression soft. "I feel the same way," I said, pulling her closer. But as she rested her head against my chest, I caught a glimpse of something in her eyes. It wasn't love. It was resolve. April had made up her mind. Whatever she was planning, it was going to happen soon. I just had to make sure I was ready when it did. That night, after April fell asleep, I slipped out of bed and called Dwayne. Mallory's team had been monitoring everything from a nearby safe house, but I needed an update. "She's getting bolder," I said, keeping my voice low. "We're running out of time." Dwayne's voice was steady. "We've got everything we need to move. Mallory's prepping the local authorities now. You just have to hold on a little longer." I hung up and sat in the dark, staring out at the moonlit ocean. The endgame was here. April thought she was the one pulling the strings, but she didn't realize the net was already closing in around her. Tomorrow, her symphony would reach its final crescendo, and I would be the one writing the last note. The next morning, April seemed brighter than ever, her mood almost euphoric. She made us breakfast, humming softly as she moved around the kitchen. Watching her, I couldn't help but wonder how someone so seemingly warm could be so calculated. "Big plans for today?" I asked casually. She smiled. "I thought we could spend some time at the cove again. Maybe pack a picnic." Her suggestion wasn't surprising, but it still sent a ripple of unease through me. The cove was isolated, exactly the kind of place someone would choose if they didn't want witnesses. "Sounds perfect," I said, keeping my tone light. While she prepared, I made a quick call to Mallory. "It's happening today," I said. "She's taking me to the cove." "We'll be in position," Mallory assured me. "Stick to the plan." We left mid-morning, April's excitement palpable. The hike to the cove was quiet, the only sounds the rustling leaves and the distant crash of waves. April seemed relaxed, her demeanor almost playful. But I knew better. At the cove, she spread out a blanket and began unpacking the picnic. Wine, sandwiches, fruit, it looked idyllic, but I was keenly aware of every move she made. When she poured the wine, she handed me a glass with a smile. "To us," she said, raising hers. I hesitated just enough to make her notice, then took a sip. The wine tasted normal, but I knew better than to trust it. I set the glass down and smiled. "Here's to getting better." As we ate, I kept her talking, trying to draw out any slip. She stayed composed, but there was a tension in her movements, a subtle edge to her voice. She was waiting for something, for me to take the bait. But I never did. When we packed up to leave, she seemed almost disappointed. I walked beside her, keeping up the charade, knowing that Mallory and her team were already closing in. By the time we reached the villa, everything was in place. April thought she was the one setting the trap. She couldn't see it was her turn to fall. Back at the villa, April's demeanor shifted. The lightness she'd carried earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet intensity. She excused herself to the kitchen, and I followed her with careful steps, staying just out of sight. Through the crack in the doorway, I watched as she poured 2 glasses of water. Her hand hovered over one, and she added something from a small vial. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. She brought the glasses back to the living room, smiling like nothing was wrong. "Here," she said, handing one to me. "You must be thirsty after the hike." I took the glass, swirling the water slightly. "Thanks," I said, raising it to my lips but stopping short. "You know, I think I'd rather have wine. Mind if I grab a glass?" Her smile faltered for a split second before she recovered. "Of course not." Setting the water down, I walked to the kitchen and lingered just long enough to make it clear I was watching. When I returned, I saw her glance at the glass I'd left untouched. She looked up at me, her face a mask of calm. "You didn't drink the water," she said lightly, but her voice held an edge. "I guess I wasn't that thirsty after all," I replied, sitting across from her. The tension in the room was palpable, and I could see her mind racing. She was trying to decide if I knew, if her plan had been discovered. I just stared back, letting the silence grow. Finally, she stood. "I think I'll go freshen up," she said, her tone clipped. As she walked away, I texted Dwayne. She made her move. "Get ready." The net was closing in. April didn't know it yet, but this was the last game she'd ever play. April's footsteps faded as she headed upstairs, and I took the opportunity to prepare. Mallory and her team were already positioned outside the villa, waiting for my signal. I glanced at the untouched glass of water, then carefully poured it into a sample container Mallory had given me. Whatever April had planned for me, it wouldn't go unchecked. When she came back downstairs, she was composed, but I could see the cracks forming. Her movements were sharp, deliberate, as if she were struggling to keep control. "I thought we could have a quiet night," she said, sitting down beside me. "Just us." I nodded. "That sounds nice." We sat in silence for a while, the tension between us building. I could feel her watching me, waiting for some sign of weakness. But I gave her nothing. Instead, I turned the conversation toward the trip. "This place is incredible," I said, forcing a smile. "It almost feels like a dream." She tilted her head, studying me. "Doesn't it? It's the kind of place where you could just let everything go." Her words were laced with double meaning, and my pulse quickened. "It's hard to believe we'll have to leave soon," I said, keeping my tone light. "Sometimes I wish we could just stay here forever." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Sometimes, forever isn't as far away as you think." Her words hung in the air, and I realized she wasn't just testing me anymore, she was making her move. I reached for my phone, sending the signal to Mallory. "It's time." Moments later, there was a knock at the door. April's head snapped toward it, her composure faltering. "Were you expecting someone?" she asked, her voice tight. I shook my head. "Not at all." The knock came again, more insistent this time. April stood, her movements tense. As she opened the door, Mallory and her team stepped inside, their badges on display. "April Sutton," Mallory said, her voice firm. "You're under arrest." April's eyes widened, but she quickly masked her surprise with indignation. "What is this? On what grounds?" Mallory stepped forward. "We have evidence of your involvement in multiple homicides, conspiracy to commit murder, and financial fraud. We suggest you cooperate." April turned to me, her face a mixture of anger and betrayal. "Gerard, what is this?" I stood, meeting her gaze. "It's the truth, April. I know everything." For the first time, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but the agents moved in, securing her wrists in handcuffs. As they led her out of the villa, she struggled, shouting denials and threats. "You'll regret this, Gerard," she screamed as the door closed behind her. The silence that followed was deafening, but for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. It wasn't over yet, but April's reign of terror had finally come to an end. After April was taken away, the villa felt eerily quiet. I sat on the couch, staring at the untouched glass of water she'd poisoned, my mind racing. Dwayne entered a moment later, his expression a mix of relief and concern. "It's done," he said, sitting across from me. "She's in custody. They'll start questioning her and Justin soon." I nodded, but the weight of everything didn't lift as I'd expected. "It feels too easy," I admitted. "April's not the type to give up without a fight." Dwayne leaned forward. "That's why we're not done. Mallory's team is already pulling in the rest of their network. By the time she realizes what's happening, it'll be too late." He was right, but it didn't make it easier to process. The woman I'd built a life with, the mother of my child, had been plotting to kill me. It was a betrayal so deep that even now, it didn't feel real. That evening, Mallory returned to the villa with an update. "April's being transported to a secure facility," she said. "We've also arrested Justin Klein at his office. He had files on several other victims, including the materials he used to create the poisons." Hearing Justin's name made my stomach churn. He wasn't just an accomplice, he was the architect of so much destruction. "What about their network?" I asked. "Are you getting anyone else?" "We're working on it," Mallory replied. "Thanks to Sophie's files and the recordings you provided, we've already flagged several associates. but it'll take time to bring them all in. I nodded, grateful for Sophie's tenacity. What about April? What's her story? Mallory sighed. She's denying everything, of course. Claims the poisons were for research purposes only. But we've got enough to hold her. Once we show her the evidence, she might start talking. The thought of April trying to wriggle out of responsibility made my blood boil. She'll never admit to anything unless it benefits her, I said. You'll need to catch her off guard. Mallory smirked. Don't worry. We've got a few tricks up our sleeves. The next morning, I called Sophie to let her know April had been arrested. She listened quietly, her voice steady despite the weight of what we were discussing. She'll never stop trying to manipulate you, Sophie said. Even from behind bars. I know, I replied. But we've got her where we want her. Thanks to you, we might actually see justice. For the first time, I heard a hint of relief in Sophie's voice. I just want her to pay for what she's done. To you, to those other families. She will, I promised. We'll make sure of it. As I hung up, I felt a surge of determination. April and Justin had taken so much from me, but they wouldn't take any more. Their operation was crumbling, and for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. Now, it was time to see how far the cracks would spread. Later that day, Mallory called with news that caught me off guard. Justin Klein's already talking, she said. He folded the moment we showed him the evidence. Seriously? I asked, pacing the villa's terrace. I figured he'd hold out longer than April. Justin's not as composed as she is, Mallory replied. He's desperate to save himself. He's pinning most of the operation on her, claiming she was the brains behind the poison research and the one who chose the victims. I let out a bitter laugh. Of course he is. And I bet she'll do the same to him. Exactly, Mallory said. We'll play them against each other to get the full picture. But Justin's already given us names, key players in their network, offshore accounts, and a few other victims they had lined up. Hearing that made my stomach twist. More victims? How many lives were they planning to destroy? At least 3 more, she said. We're moving to secure them now. You and Sophie may have saved those people's lives. It was a small victory, but it didn't feel like enough. Justin might have cracked, but I knew April wouldn't go down so easily. She was too controlled, too manipulative. She'd fight to the bitter end. What about April? I asked. How's she handling it? Mallory chuckled darkly. She's still playing innocent, insisting everything was legitimate research. But when we told her Justin's talking, she went quiet. She knows the walls are closing in. That gave me a grim sense of satisfaction. For once, April wasn't the one holding all the cards. That evening, Dwayne and I sat on the villa's terrace, going over the latest developments. Justin spilling the beans is huge, Dwayne said. It puts the heat on April to make a move. I nodded. If she's backed into a corner, she might start talking too. But only if she thinks it'll benefit her. Dwayne leaned back, staring at the horizon. You think she'll try to pin it all on Justin? Without a doubt, I said. She'll paint herself as the victim, the loyal wife who got caught up in his schemes. Dwayne scoffed. She's good at lying, I'll give her that. Too good, I replied. But we've got the truth now. Her lies won't save her this time. As the sun set, I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in months. Justin's betrayal had shattered April's carefully constructed facade. The walls were closing in, and soon, she'd have nowhere left to run. The next day, Mallory called again, this time with a warning. April's lawyers just contacted us. She's willing to cooperate, but only if we grant her full immunity. I almost dropped the phone. Immunity? After everything she's done? She must think we're idiots. She's desperate, Mallory said. Justin's confession puts her in a corner, but she's still trying to play her hand. Her lawyers claim she has information that could completely dismantle the network. She's lying, I said without hesitation. She'll give you just enough to make herself look useful, then turn it around to her advantage. Mallory sighed. You're probably right. We've rejected the immunity deal for now, but she might try to escalate. Be prepared, she knows you're involved in this. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Even behind bars, April was dangerous. She'd manipulate anyone and anything to claw her way out. What's the next move? I asked. For now, we let her squirm, Mallory said. The more desperate she gets, the more likely she is to slip up. In the meantime, Justin's testimony is giving us plenty to work with. After the call, I sat in the villa's quiet living room, staring out at the ocean. April's confidence had always been her greatest weapon, but now it was her greatest weakness. She was grasping at straws, and every move she made only tightened the noose. That evening, I received an unexpected call, this time from April herself. The guards allowed it under supervision, likely to see what she'd reveal. I hesitated for a moment, then answered. "Gerard," she said, her voice soft and composed. "I wanted to hear your voice." "You're bold, I'll give you that," I said coldly. "What do you want?" She sighed. "I know you're angry, but everything I did for us. For Sophie." I clenched my jaw, my anger barely contained. "Don't you dare bring Sophie into this. She's the reason you're not already rotting in prison." April was quiet for a moment. Then her tone shifted, becoming sharper. "You think you've won, don't you? But you don't know everything. You've barely scratched the surface." "Then tell me," I said, calling her bluff. "Tell me what I don't know." She laughed softly, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Not yet. But when you do find out, you'll wish you'd listened to me." The call ended abruptly, leaving me staring at the phone in silence. Her words were cryptic, but the message was clear: she wasn't done playing her games. Whatever she thought she still had, it wouldn't be enough. Not this time. April's cryptic warning lingered in my mind as I worked with Mallory and her team to tie up loose ends. Every day brought new revelations. Justin's cooperation had turned into a flood of information: financial records, coded communications, and even blueprints of their operation. April's empire was crumbling, but her words still gnawed at me. "You'll wish you'd listened to me." What could she mean by that? I asked Mallory during one of our meetings. Mallory leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against the table. "She's a classic manipulator. She wants you second-guessing yourself. It's how she maintains control. But what if she's holding something back?" I pressed. "Something we haven't found yet?" Mallory hesitated. "It's possible, but unlikely. Justin's testimony and the evidence we've gathered are airtight. Whatever she's hinting at is probably just a bluff." Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that April had one last card to play. Dwayne agreed. "She's not the type to go down quietly," he said. "If she's hiding something, we'll find it." Sophie called later that evening, her voice steady but tinged with concern. "Dad, I've been thinking about Mom's research files. There was one folder I couldn't open. It was encrypted differently than the rest." "What was it labeled?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "Legacy," she said. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I wonder if it's important. The word sent a chill through me. Legacy. It sounded like April's way of leaving something behind, a final statement or threat. "I'll forward it to Mallory," I said. "She'll know what to do." "Be careful, Dad," Sophie said. "I don't trust her, even now." "Neither do I assured her. "But this is almost over." The next day, Mallory's tech team cracked the encrypted folder. Inside were detailed plans, potential victims, additional accomplices, and a list of high-ranking individuals April had planned to blackmail using her network's resources. It was a contingency plan, designed to keep her operation alive even if she and Justin were caught. "She wasn't bluffing," Mallory said, her expression grim. "This changes everything. If we don't act fast, her network could reorganize." "What do we do?" I asked. "We dismantle every piece of it," Mallory replied. "This isn't just about taking April down anymore. It's about ensuring no one else can pick up where she left off." That night, I sat alone on the villa's terrace, staring at the ocean. April had always been 2 steps ahead, even in defeat. But this time, we were closing the gap.